It is
So,
recording.
yeah,
Okay. My name's Gabriella, and I'm the director of the counseling program at Head and
Gab is here today, is so kindly joining us to help us explore this module about consent and navigating healthy relationships and how we go about that. We're so grateful to have you here. One thing I hear a lot in talking about healthy relationships is the importance of communication. I feel like that comes up a lot, communicating our needs and learning about our partner's needs. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit for those of us who maybe have never had experiences with relationships, with romantic or intimate relationships, or who don't particularly feel like we have a roadmap for healthy relationship. How can we go about knowing what our needs even are in order to communicate them and how we do that individuation work?
we sort of like put romantic relationships on this like pedestal as if they're like so different from like other relationships and so much more intense. And in a way that's true because, sharing, the sort of relational intimacy that sort of can arise in romantic relationships is this really vulnerable thing, and it adds a new dimension to maybe that we haven't seen in other relationships that we've been in. So I think there's some sort of value to like that separation, but at the same time I think it can obscure the fact that like a romantic relationship is just a type of relationship, right? And we've all been, unless we were like raised by wolves, like we've been in relationships for most of our life, right? Like parents, friends, classmates, people we were in like clubs with, drawing on the relationships that you have been in, and like what have you needed from those relationships? What has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? Like, right now I'm in like a domestic partnership that's not romantic. But we are like, we cook for each other, we take care of each other, we share the bills, like we do all these things that have sort of been defined as like happening within the context of a romantic relationship. And there isn't like relational, like sexual intimacy, but like I'm like practicing and learning a lot of skills that I think will be really applicable when and if I do decide to have that kind of romantic partnership with someone. And I think that's kind of like a way of, it's like, it's like queering relationships, because that's what queer folks have done, right? Is like explored and like expanded our concepts of what relationships are outside of heteropatriarchy. So, I think if we can do that within ourselves, that can like sort of, provide a really fertile ground for like entering into romance. Another thing that I think is really important is like practicing romantic love with yourself, right? Like the relationship you have with yourself is 100% the most important relationship you'll ever have. And it's 100% the most like devalued and neglected in our culture. We're not taught to think about or learn about like how to practice that kind of intimacy with ourselves. And, the ways that we might do that, talking about like the ways that we learn about like what masturbation is, it's like nobody really talks about like how that's a sexual relationship, right? Like you're having a sexual relationship with yourself. It's just like, oh, you do that, and when you're in a romantic relationship, then that's gone. It's like, no, actually it's not true at all for anyone that I talk to. So that's just one dimension, right? There's like sexuality and the ways we express intimacy with our bodies, but then there's also like what makes you feel cared for? Like what can you do for yourself that makes you feel cared for? Like what makes you feel heard? Like for me it's journaling. For other people it might be like talking into their voice notes, or like telling themselves affirmations when they wake up in the morning. But like I think practicing that kind of relational intimacy with ourselves really primes us for entering into romantic relationships. Because I think a lot of us, like, when we're young, we just like enter into romantic relationships and we're like, okay, this person's now going to give me all the things that I need, because that's what the media has taught me my entire life. And it really sets us up to fail in romance. Untangling needs from expectations, right? Like unlearning what the media has taught you to expect from relationships, unlearning what the media has taught you to think relationships should be, that like queering piece, and like unlearning this idea that like somebody else needs to give you the things that you need. Like if you can really practice giving yourself those things, like I think you're much more equipped to be able to like state those needs that you might like reasonably have for a romantic partner, like when you enter into romance.
I was thinking about the ways that responding to our own needs sometimes stops when we enter romantic or intimate relationships. We believe that that relationship with ourselves, those needs need to now be replaced by somebody else. And I'm just reflecting a lot on what a trap that is, and what a huge ask that is to also like ask that of somebody to give you all of your needs, and to kind of say, well, like, you know, passing on everything.
Yeah. And that's where that trap of codependency comes in, right? Like, because if you get in the habit of somebody else sort of doing all the things that you need to do for yourself, like then what happens when that person goes away?
Yeah, I also really like the piece that you brought in about like realizing that we also have like different type of relationships also with different people, in the sense that like we really do put like romantic relationship on a pedestal, but there are also like multitude of like relationships that you can have with people where like romance can be present. I feel like sometimes even with friends we forget that, but like sometimes like going to the restaurant with your friends, or like taking time to choose like a nice gift for your friend, that's like things that can also be seen as like romance. Yeah, being able to like see different like the different aspect of all the relationship that we have, and how like the like a romantic relationship does not to be so far to be like dissociated from all the other relationship that you do, that can all like exist together and be present together basically.
That's an incredible point too, right? Like, because if your friendships have romance, like then there's not as much of this like need to go and get it somewhere else. Like you don't feel this void when you're not in a romantic relationship.
It's so interesting to think of the ways like heteronormativity have created these like restrictions of what can or cannot, and what must or must not exist in certain kinds of relationships, and how much that limits like some relationships and puts far too much pressure, unrealistic amounts of pressure on others.
The sort of the spreading out, right? Like if relational intimacy isn't just happening in the context of this one pinnacle romantic relationship that we're like striving for, it can sort of be distributed in all of these other areas of our lives so that we're more supported in a regular way.
If you want a different relationship than someone else wants, how do you deal with the feelings of rejection?
We've all been there. And it fucking hurts. The first things that sort of come into my head are like, be gentle with yourself. Because I think often when we feel those feelings of rejection, we're like, I shouldn't feel this way. Like, it's not okay to feel this way. Like, I need to be okay on my own. And then also, like, we make it about us. Like, there's something wrong with me. I'm like flawed in this fundamental way. And this person's rejection has like revealed that. So now I have to like sit with all of these things I don't like about myself, or that I've imagined are wrong with me. And like hold space for the heartbreak. Like don't run away from it, or don't like deny yourself of it. Like you're entitled to feel that pain, like that hurt of like you wanted this from somebody, or you wanted this, you felt this with somebody and they didn't feel it with you. They weren't in it with you. They didn't want it from you. Or they didn't want you. Like that, it hurts. Especially it hurts in a world where we place, again, like coming back from that first question, so much emphasis on these external relationships to invigorate us, make us alive, make us worthwhile, make us important. So I know it's hard, but holding space for that heartbreak, sitting with that heartbreak, you know, asking it what it needs, from you, letting those tears fall. Again, bringing in those love languages, taking care of yourself, wrapping yourself in a warm blanket, asking for support where you need it, watching movies that make you feel happy, like writing in your journal, writing angry, sad love poetry. Like some of my best writing has come from those feelings of rejection, like making magic with it, like creating alchemy with it. I mean, there's really a lot that heartbreak can give to you. And if we run away from it, like we miss all of those opportunities. And we miss the opportunity to learn, like, okay, well, what wasn't working here? Because something wasn't working, right? Because it didn't work. And maybe it wasn't supposed to work, but maybe it was supposed to teach me something. And that's a bit of a mindset shift, and it might take some time to get there, but I really believe that sitting with our own heartbreak helps us get to the place where we can ask those questions. You know, once you've sort of done that, you've let the tears fall, you've started to do the writing or whatever it is, you've asked for help in the ways that you need to. I think then it becomes like a practice of not taking it personally, right? Like connecting to the idea of like agency, individual agency. Everyone has agency over their own life. Everyone has the right to make their own decisions about what it is they want, including you, and including this person who hurt you. And so sort of recognizing everybody's here for a reason, and maybe your reasons didn't align. And this is really where I think self-compassion comes in, of like, when we experience a rejection like that, it just cuts us so deep that it can, again, like bring up these things that maybe we're holding on to, that we don't like about ourselves, or that we're afraid of within ourselves, or past hurts. Just practice the self-compassion. That can also help us sit in the brokenheartedness. It can help us remember that other people don't define our worth. Mm-hmm. Our worth is inherent.
I feel like the advice you gave was like actually for me to incorporate. So, in myself, like it's easy, like for any kind of rejection, even like it's even with another person, or like not getting the job that you want, or like not like getting the grant that you want. It's like really difficult to deal with in general, and it's really easy to default to that piece of being like, I didn't do something well, or like I suck, or like I'm a terrible person, or like that person like hates me, it's fine. Whereas like sometimes like, yeah, the piece that you mentioned about like being able to like accept that like maybe that was not meant, like we're not meant to be together, like we're not like aligned, or like that opportunity wasn't mine to have in this specific moment. Also sometimes it's just for a season in your life, and to really be able to like truly like accept that, even if it's hard to like sit with that, and be able to like offer yourself compassion, but also like offer the other person also like a certain sense of like compassion.
Not taking that time to sit with whatever feelings come up with you. I think it doesn't always, but it can lead to weaponizing our victimhood, or you know, those feelings of hurt can easily kind of be blurred into feeling like others owe us something, or making the person who rejected us feel uncomfortable for their honesty, or make them feel guilty, or you know, all these things that, you know, like if we're not careful in taking care of ourselves, can lead to us actually causing harm. You know, even if it hurts, you gotta respect someone's agency and someone's decision, and if they say it once, they mean it. They're not going to change their mind unless they tell you they've changed their mind, you know, and that is just like our responsibility. In our intro video on this site, we talk a little bit about how different experiences of trauma can affect sex or intimacy. You know, those of us who know that we have certain triggers, or we've had certain experiences that were harmful, what are ways that we can go about those discussions in ways that, like, you know, can help us feel as safe and protected as possible?
Yeah. You also asked a really important question in when you sent me the list, which was like, how can our partners support us and help us work towards healing?
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we'll get around to that as well, because that's, I think it's, you don't want to lose that piece, right? Like there's a lot of potential, right? Of like, if we have these understandings, if we have these traumas, how do we negotiate that? How do we move through that with our partners? Like it's so tender and raw, really. But there's a lot of potential and possibility here for repair, right? Like in the context of a romantic relationship where we're able to feel held and seen and safe as all that we are, with all of our pain, with all of our hurt, with all of our trauma, in all of our triggers, in those moments where we freeze or we fight because that's what we've learned how to do, because that's what our nervous system knows how to do, because it's trying to keep us safe. How do we move through that? Like there's enormous potential in that. Practicing bodily awareness, because when we get triggered, it's really a biophysical experience. Like it's really visceral, right? Like your heart speeds up, maybe your breathing stops, maybe your muscles clench or your chest, your rib cage braces. Trauma lives in the body.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's, again, not something that's very common for us to talk about. It's becoming more common, and as it becomes more common, there's lots of problems that are coming up, but like that's another conversation for another interview perhaps. At a base level, what does a yes feel like in my body? What does a no feel like in my body? And that those experiences are really subtle, and it takes time to get to know them. So we might be like at a cognitive level, like, oh, I know that when I get triggered, I get angry, right? Like we might have sort of understandings of our emotions and our like thought patterns, because that's more sort of taught and spoken about in our culture, but we might not understand as much like physiologically what happens. We really need, I think, to build and solidify a sort of a relationship with our own bodies and our own consent, in order to navigate intimacy with other people, like just period. Like I just think that that's absolutely necessary. I think the lack of it is really a source of why there is just so much sexual violence and trauma in our cultures, you know, because we don't know nobody teaches us how to do that. It's like this very specialized skill that like maybe you develop because you like had a somatic therapist once, or like, you know, or because it was so loud that you couldn't run away from it anymore. It's kind of coming back to the first question. Again, we're not taught to practice relationship with ourselves at all, really. I think the core of this question is really also about communication. I mean, I think, again, the first thing is these conversations are they're scary. They're not the norm. So just like some really sort of like concrete, practical guidance is like practice. You know, if you're sort of gearing, you know, you've entered into some sort of romantic or sexual relationship, and you know you have an awareness that your past traumas might come up, like it's a good idea to get ahead of it and like have a conversation before you've, you know, been sleeping together and something's happened, right? So I think practicing these conversations is really important. When we get into the conversation itself, the trigger's probably going to come up in the system. When we are in that sort of fight, flight, whatever it is, fawn mode, our sort of higher brain kind of shuts down. It can be hard to communicate. Maybe you got to practice like with yourself in the mirror, or like in a journal, or like in a voice note. And again, practice speaking what your truth is, and notice what's coming up in your body, you know, so there's a relational understanding as you move through before you got to get into that sort of high stakes situation. I also think it's important to remember that like you don't have to be perfect. Like you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to know exactly what it is you need. I think some of the beauty of having these conversations with partners is to sort of like be curious, like with together, like build that sort of intimacy and that practice of like, here's what comes up for me sometimes when like you touch my left hip. I don't know why, but can we explore that together? Like, is this a good container for me to sort of, you see how that feels? And maybe you might have things that feel hard. Like maybe there might be things that you don't like nobody nobody 100% has it figured out, like what they actually want from intimacy, or like how they feel safe, because like we haven't really, again, been taught to think about that. So they're really beautiful opportunities, these conversations, to like build that intimacy. It's a profound expression of trust to let people in this way, and to tell them what's real for you, what's alive for you, even if it's hard and scary. There's like so much fertile ground in these spaces of tenderness, in this like, you know, opening up and showing. And you can decide like what's the just right amount for you to open up your heart and to share that tenderness. Like it doesn't have to happen all at once. And sometimes just the act of broaching can have healing potential.
I feel like one thing in this site and in like the Sense Project's kind of core is this idea of conversations around consent being like an ongoing thing, that it happens before, during, and after any kind of intimacy. I'm so grateful that I feel like you expanded that line for us to go like, why do you even need to be in a relationship for consent practice to happen? The line is really just so expansive of how these conversations can happen and when they can happen.
So many different contexts every day in which you say yes or no, explicitly or implicitly. Do I want this orange right now? Like, does my body want to eat this orange? Like, yeah, consent, it's in every aspect of everything that we do. If you've survived sexual trauma, like you have actually a lot of really important insight and wisdom about consent and about like relational intimacy and how relational intimacy can be safe, that you can share with your partner, and that might actually be a blessing for them. Like that might allow them to extend a level of consciousness that they didn't have before. You're not a burden. You're a blessing.
I feel like it also honors the idea that, you know, like healing from trauma is not like linear. So like taking time to like talk about it, like you might like during those talks like discover other ways in which you will be triggered that you are not even aware of. And it's also honoring that like it's a process of you telling the other person, but also again like for you it's a process of also like being able to like heal from those trauma, and also exploring the different ways in which they like it comes up to you and how it affects you. Also, there's no time limit to trauma, and there's no like perfect timeline to how you experience trauma. It's like honoring that in conversation, I feel, is also really an important piece. How do you make your boundaries clear without hurting your partner's feelings?
Boundaries. I love boundaries. Boundaries are just so important. They're really an act of love for ourselves, a coming back all the time to self-compassion. Like I just love self-compassion, like forever. And boundaries are really an act of self-compassion, I think, because it's like you're naming what you need and what makes you feel good, and also what isn't right for you. Again, like this piece of like internal consent is so foundational to boundary setting. There might not be a way to avoid hurting someone's feelings. Like that just might not be possible, right? Like it depends on the boundary. A very kind of important component of boundary setting is also managing reactions to our boundaries. A quote that I love that my dear friend Vesna, who's a coach, wonderful life coach, quotes when she talks about boundaries it's from Mark Groves, who says, "Walls keep everybody out, and boundaries teach people where the door is." Because I think when we set a boundary and somebody is hurt by it, they're sort of perceiving it as the first part, right? Like they're perceiving it as a wall, and they're being kept out. And really, I think when we're setting a boundary, it can help to sort of remind them, like, this is not a wall, this is a door. And you're allowed to have feelings about it, by the way. It's okay for us to talk about those feelings, but that doesn't mean the boundary is going to change, right? Like part of setting boundaries is also maintaining boundaries. And there might be some compromise. Hey, it's your boundary. You get to decide how flexible, how malleable, whether it's a screen door or like a steel door with a lock is really up to you. I think a really helpful thing when we set a boundary with somebody is also to ask them like what boundary they need, because it's also very courageous to set a boundary with a romantic partner in a world that encourages us to just sort of like dive headfirst into relationships with no regard for our own well-being or what we actually need from them. So to sort of state a boundary is really quite courageous, and maybe they might have some boundaries that they didn't know that they had, or that are there in their consciousness or their awareness, but they haven't been able to state because they've been too nervous or scared or worried about hurting your feelings. So I think that can help. And just like, yeah, like they're allowed to have feelings. That's okay. But I guess a little cautionary thing I would say is like, if someone is consistently resistant to and hurt by your boundaries, that might be a sign that you're maybe not in the same place in terms of your approach to relational intimacy. We need to be in relationships where we're able to state our consent, and for that to be okay. And if that's becoming, too burdensome, like if the whole relationship is kind of a bit premised on a lot of tension about those boundaries, it's not a great sign. Like they're sticky and they're hard. Boundaries are sticky and hard, and that's totally fine. But if your whole relationship has now become like a sort of battleground for your boundaries, at one point in the draft for these questions, there was a question about like deal breakers. And for me, that's probably a deal breaker.
A lot of us grew up with negative role models for romantic or intimate love, and we may have seen a lot of toxicity in the romantic relationships around us growing up. How do we ensure that we don't internalize what we've seen around us and reproduce that in our own relationships? And how can we go about the unlearning process?
How can we make sure that we don't internalize? I think that's impossible. I think we're internalizing all the time, like from the moment that we're born to the moment that we die, and especially those first 30 or so years probably. So the question really it becomes unlearning, right? And unlearning, and not just unlearning, but building scaffolding again, like as we sort of deconstruct these internalized pathways. What are we building? What are we creating? What are we putting into the space left behind? Okay, well, as we're unlearning, a lot of what we're doing is saying like, no, that doesn't work for me. Like, no, I don't want that. And so it becomes like, what do you want? I mean, I think I'm in a good position to speak on this, not just sort of like from my position of whatever expertise with mental health, but also like I spent the last year doing a lot of really active unlearning. Of dynamics that I learned in my family and from my ancestors. Dynamics of toxicity, dynamics of codependency, dynamics of a lot of poor immigrant women holding responsibility for everyone else in their life. And the ways that I was also doing that in my relationships. And the ways that pattern really led me into a lot of relationships that were harmful for me. And so as we do that process, again, I think it's incredibly important to have support. I did not do that work alone. I did that work with the help of a couple therapists. And obviously that's a privilege, right? To have access to that kind of resource. But, it doesn't have to be a therapist per se. It could be a friend who also has had some similar experience that you have had. It could be a peer support worker. It's really, I think, it's a process of really active self-reflection. And in that active self-reflection, again, deciding what am I trying to release? What am I trying to let go of? And what are the structures and supports that will help me in letting go of that? And maybe there's some grieving that needs to happen as I let go. Like for me, it's like, if I release responsibility for everyone around me and I stop holding responsibility for everyone else's emotions, I have to accept their suffering. You know, I have to accept that I can't fix it. And that's heartbreaking. And that takes time. But like, what supports you in releasing the things that you don't need anymore? How do those things show up in your life? How do they show up in your relationships? And for what will it serve for you to release it? What are you going to invite in now? And then the question becomes, what do I want now? Like, okay, I don't have to be in codependent relationships where I take care of everyone for the rest of my life. What relationships do I want to have? What will my relationships look like? And then gentleness. Like, don't beat yourself up in this process. Don't ask, like, why am I like this? Think about like where you might have learned that. Because like we're just sponges. Like we're learning our whole lives, and a lot of things that we carry do not actually belong to us. And that doesn't mean like going away from the toxic dynamics that you grew up with. I mean, I work with a lot of like immigrant youth, and I've heard they've worked with other therapists maybe who have sort of said like, okay, well, you gotta like shut that down. Like if your parents are toxic, like we don't want you just need to spend less time with them. And it's like, we don't want to like leave our families. Like it's, and maybe there's, for some folks that is what they need, and that's perfectly fine. But like, I think when we do this internal excavation, there's actually a lot more room for us to show up in our families where oftentimes we learn these unhealthy dynamics, and actually create change just by being these new versions of ourselves.
A big part of how I learned love was through sacrifice. Like when someone loves you, they sacrifice things for you and they put themselves through hardship for you. And it took me years. And like still, I feel like I haven't learned the extent to which I like feel that I need that piece of sacrifice to be there to feel like I have loved someone.
Yeah, I also feel like part of it, like in being able to like acknowledge and like question where we learn certain behaviors. I think, granted, it's not possible for everybody to do, or it's helped me like kind of be able to like humanize my parents, not in a way where you just like, oh, okay, because they also suffered like everything that like I've been through it, at their hands is like justifiable. But I think it's more so like being in the space of being able to see your family members, or to see your parents for like who they are, but also for the trauma. And I feel like sometimes like as a child of immigrant is also like a difficult thing, in the sense that like you see you're sometimes, like for me in my case, you're able to see your parents' trauma like so vividly, but also being able to like see that they will never be able to like see that trauma or like access that part of the trauma because it's way too much for them. Like, being able to acknowledge what they went through, and then at the same time acknowledge that like what they went through has like an impact on you, balancing both, right? Like humanizing people without like forgetting like the real impact and effects that it had on you. And there's also power in you being able to like acknowledge, like, as much as like I love my parents, or I would have loved to have a relationship with your parent, to be able to be like, for me it's not possible. And like there's also power in deciding to like remove yourself from that, right? Like both of those realities can like exist in like different spaces also.
Yes, holding space for the complexity is so crucial, because it's not about fixing it, right? It's about understanding what is true for you. There is like a vast lineage of suffering for most of us, right? And that as we're doing this work, it's not always about just us, right? It's like, what are we carrying from our parents? What are we carrying from our parents' parents and their parents' parents? And that's a lot to bring in and to hold and to heal. So patience, gentleness, self-compassion, complexity, like all of these things I think are resources that can support us in doing this work, and moving forward to like an embodied awareness of ourselves that is supportive and nourishing and helps us create the lives that we want for ourselves.